My name is Chris Sanderson. I'm co-founder of the Future Laboratory. We're a consumer insight and trend forecasting business that works across different market sectors to help businesses to better understand the future consumer. And with that in mind, it was so great to hear Marie-Julie speak earlier about the nature of Ghelamco being such a people-centered business, because trust me, after 20 years of doing this, I'm still amazed at how many businesses do not actually put their customer first and do not put the customer, the citizen, the consumer, however you choose to label us all, front and center in your strategy. So it's actually really, really heartening at this point in time to be working and partnering with an organization looking at this idea of people-centered design, people-centered strategies, and just thinking about what the future consumer is going to need. Because as we move into an increasingly uncertain market for all sorts of reasons, be it political as well as social and increasingly environmental, I think we all realize that we've got a pretty difficult 10 years ahead. Many of us have enjoyed continued economic prosperity over the last 50 to 60 years, and I don't know a single business leader who can speak with any sense of certainty as to what the next 10 years will be like. We're living through uncertain times. We're living through a period of great change. But with that change, of course, comes challenges and opportunities. And we're all, I think, increasingly aware that the greatest challenge we currently face is this notion that here we are facing a code red in terms of how we, in the era and the age of the Anthropocene, the man-made world, have the opportunity to actually be masters of our own destiny. And with that in mind, Ghelamco asked us to produce a report to look at the notion of sustainability. What does it mean? How do we cut through the noise, the confusion, and start to think about some of the things that can be safely predicted when it comes to understanding what our future citizen and customer and client is going to need moving forward. So to help us to understand that, I first want to deliver just 3 key drivers that are shaping the world around us, and not just in terms of development and urban planning and infrastructure, but in a much broader context as well. So let's just think about some of those cultural, economic, and consumer movements that are redefining the world around us. And the 3 that I'd like to, there are more, there are 3 that I'd just like to share with you in the time I've got with you are these: eco-awakening, citizen capitalism, and business betterment. I think increasingly, just understanding the context behind the sustainability movement has never been more important. We have a whole generation of eco-adults. Many of them are your children, who are, of course, facing challenging environments and challenging times. But we're also seeing a climate, of course, where it's getting very easy to jump on the bandwagon of the eco-conscious movement, as we see increasingly brands greenwashing their past to think about what their future might look like, but also maybe racing towards B Corp status or whatever else it is that they might want to have as a goal. And yet underneath it is the realization that actually we're having to be so much more granular in our understanding of what sustainability actually means and represents. We're having to go under the surface. Well, research from numerous different sources has begun to understand and to show us, to demonstrate that our customer, our client, our society is increasingly eco-facing and wants to be more sustainable and wants to find ways to be more sustainable. And indeed, it's important, according to the World Wildlife Fund, it's important to note that this eco-awakening is not only manifesting in high-income countries, but on a global scale. In Latin America, Ecuador, for example, has seen a phenomenal rise of 120% in online searches for sustainable goods in the past 5 years. So this is not just a nice little lifestyle trend. This is a shift in the way that we think about the future of our planet. So that sense of the awakening is something that we need to understand. This is what our future businesses are going to expect us as a basic, as a default. So increasingly, this isn't about a nice little bit of carbon neutrality. It's about how we actually have a net contribution that is positive towards our environment as organizations. Our next driver starts to look at this idea of the changing nature of capitalism, of our societies, what we as citizens demand. And of course, increasingly, we're using the word citizen instead of consumer, because we are separating out both our requirements as individuals, from a political perspective, from a social perspective, as opposed to just what it is that we buy and we consume. Now, obviously, our online environments are having a huge amount to play in this, that sense of equity that we all have now in being able to understand more, to learn more, to find out more. And we're beginning to see, of course, how our traditional power structures are being challenged by our 21st century consumer. Think too, of course, in our online environments of the rise, for example, of what's been called the DAO, the DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization that challenges the top-down hierarchical structure of our traditional societies and business structures, and instead continues to create more federated, more hierarchical structures that determine potentially future success. We're beginning to see the rise of regenerative government policies, with dozens of nations stepping up their commitments to go beyond the Paris Agreement, with more than 3/4 of the world economy hopefully being on track for decarbonisation by mid-century. That's according to the World Economic Forum. But of course, such progress is also fraught with contradictions, and some institutions continue to lose trust. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals set to be achieved by 2030 are not on track, and we won't actually meet them till, it is estimated, 2082. So that sense, I think, of how increasingly we're not leaving these judgments and these decisions, and indeed this action, up to our governments. We as citizens are taking matters into our own hands, and we are demanding more accountability, and we indeed are changing our own lifestyles to be more sustainably aware. So, as investors continue to prioritize ESG criteria, and we see the rise in opportunities like B Corp, we're beginning to see how more and more businesses are thinking about what it means to leave a positive legacy as part of their strategic thinking as an organization. And according to KPMG, 80% of businesses worldwide are now reporting on their sustainability practices, which is great news. However, according to other research, the average US company spends just 0.13% of its revenue on corporate social responsibility. So clearly, there's a bit of a gap here between what we're saying and what we're actually doing. And this, of course, is where confusion starts to arise, purpose or the lack of purpose, this notion of greenwashing, all of these becoming issues that we as consumers are facing on a daily basis, not quite sure what to believe, who to trust, or what the way forward might be. So increasingly, we're going to have to start to think about the opportunities, both for us as individuals, as citizens, as consumers, but also from a corporate and governmental perspective, because the sustainability journey is one of continual reflection and improvement. This isn't about a quick fix. It's about a long-term process that we need to engender that will exist well beyond a brand or an organization's lifestyle. But as I've said, challenge presents opportunity. And here in the 21st century, one of the most exciting things is how business, technology, industry is determined to find solutions and ways forward. So let's just spend a couple of minutes thinking about this within the context of our workplaces, of materials, and also architecture itself. Now, rethinking a company's KPIs, or key performance indicators, is clearly a great way to start when we think about sustainability. And as it starts to break out of the idea that it's just about something that is discussed at a board level, that it's a corporate issue, we begin to understand how it's spreading throughout a business and becomes endemic in every part of a successful organization. And the way that we measure the success of a business is moving away, I think, from selling more to selling better. And increasingly, we hear this as a mantra from more and more organizations: fewer but better. And this could be everything from financially incentivizing workers to design more sustainable products and services and to be more in control of their logistics processes and pipelines in an organization to save time, to save effort, to save money, to save energy. It could be about motivating them to opt for slower, more considered production decisions rather than cutting corners. It might mean actually planning the end of your business rather than thinking about the fact that it has to go on forever. And in fact, I think sustainability issues are forcing planned obsolescence to also be retired from the technology sector. And we're seeing massive pushback against this idea that a product cycle should be so short and should in fact be a much longer idea. And the practice is being reclaimed by a whole new generation of design teams who are thinking about this idea of how they design product to last for longer and to last better rather than ending up in landfill. So as brands change their production models in favour of this notion of what's been called the circular economy or a regenerative economy, we start to see how our consumption continues to evolve and change. And according to the product designer Layla Saad, imagine an idea of how you could download and print your latest Adidas trainers and then reuse the materials to reprint a new pair the year after. Well, 3D printing is with us already. We're not quite at the fourth industrial revolution yet, but it's certainly around the corner in some shape or form. And the idea that we see new businesses popping up and new buildings popping up all around our towns and cities that are rethinking the process of regenerative design or sustainable design is something we're seeing more and more of. So here, for example, we've got the War Thistleton project built for British Land, story, which looks at this idea of a timber-built building that was designed to be demountable. And that idea of how we start to think about building specific sites and projects for a new generation of workers, a new generation of homeowners is, of course, hugely important. Now, we're beginning to, I think, also understand how our business structures are beginning to change. We've just been through one of the biggest shocks that most of us, in terms of our working lives, have ever seen because of the coronavirus pandemic. And whilst many of us have returned to work, without a doubt, the nature of work and the way in which we choose to work has changed forever. And new leadership, I think, is continuing to demonstrate how businesses can not only recenter their environmental initiatives, but also imbue them with care and inclusivity. And it was great, again, to hear Mary-Julie talk about how important mental well-being was when it came to designing the Arc. So business is on the move. Business is changing. In corporate America, for example, there's been a dramatic growth in the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer. And within Fortune 500 companies, we've seen demand for this role surge by 228%. We're also obviously continuing to strive for other equalities or equities, but we're looking at a whole host, I think, of new intersectional considerations that are changing the nature and the fabric of the very buildings that we are wanting to construct for tomorrow's society and tomorrow's consumer. We're thinking about the materiality of our buildings and what's on offer. And next-gen materials have come a long way since we first unveiled our first Far Futures Material Index back in 2015. But I think what we're beginning to see is rather than looking for a holy grail solution, increasingly we're beginning to understand how businesses can make small, incremental changes into the way that they think about design, practice, and build. The picture we've got on screen, for example, is focusing on the urgent need for biodiversity and rewilding in inner-city areas. And the project that you can see, this sculpture, is called Mellifera, the Dancing Beehives, by the French architect Arthur Mamou Mani, who took its inspiration from the beehives that sit on the roof of Fortnum & Mason. This is Fortnum & Mason here in London. And the spiralling 3D printed model is made from fermented sugar, and it highlights the structural possibilities of bioplastics and polylactic acid, thinking about its building opportunities and possibilities in the years to come. And that sense of how we look at renewables, look at new materials and our opportunity to build with them is again presenting both challenges but opportunities for architects and designers alike. Scientists, for example, at Cardiff University are currently developing self-healing bacteria for buildings and historic structures. Self-healing masonry could be triggered to mend any sort of damage to the stone, releasing bacteria and a range of helper chemicals that could heal any damage autonomously. We move, I think, towards the idea of a very different type of building structure, the growth of what's been called neurotic architecture, where we apply biomimicry to actually copy the way that life forms actually repair and heal. And with the creative use of waste and innovative materials that we're beginning to see, we begin to understand how we both repurpose but also sequester emissions within the very buildings that we design and build. Canadian startup Carbon Cure has created a material called carbicrete, which looks at challenging the traditional type of concrete that we see used in buildings. They've also been working on Carbon Cure, which uses captured CO2 emissions to cure cement. They're on a mission to reduce 500 megatons of carbon emissions annually by the year 2030. Its method allows for the creation of concrete with less cement and fewer emissions. And Carbon Cure has already partnered up with Amazon for the construction of its new HQ2. Energy, however, isn't just something that is about the building and is part of the design process or the management of a building. We are all actually responsible for the use of energy within the corporate environment. And according to the World Economic Forum, 20% of all electricity usage by 2025 will be down to you and I and the amount of energy that we use on our Google searches and sending emails and shopping online. The IT industry is expected to use 20% of all electricity produced by 2025. So the challenge is both an individual one as well as a corporate one. But as I said, we're beginning to enter a whole new era of architecture that is energetic, that is biomimic, that is biophilic, and is also, as I've said, neurotic. The idea that we live with mono-use or dumb buildings rather than flexible formats and platforms that provide hyperlocal energy, community facilities and work at one with the locale is increasingly what we're beginning to move towards. According to the World Green Building Council, building and construction are responsible for 39% of all carbon emissions in the world. The ARC, as a project, redistributes surplus energy and fosters biodiversity in London through its greenery, its greening places, and also the substrates that it's starting to use. Again in London, Morris & Company's Energy Hub is a mixed-use building in Elephant and Castle, comprising a heat and power facility, a nursery, a community cafe, and a pocket park. And Ghelamco's own debut project, The Arc, I think is beginning to exemplify this trend of sustainability principles with its mixed use of retail space, gardens, fitness studios, and entertainment facilities. And the idea, of course, that it's fully electric. It's also using a cutting-edge energy surplus redistribution system and its commitment, of course, as I've said, to biodiversity. We're also seeing projects such as this. This is in Chong'an province in China, designed by the architect Vicente Guayart, where we start to think about the importance of the neighborhood and considering the people that live and work close to our projects, and how we think about communities and on-site need. And this project in Chong'an, I think, is a great example of an ecological city that is compact, mixed use, operating independently of nearby Beijing. And as the architect told us recently, with 5G technology integration, the home and the neighborhood become a service. The greenhouses on the roof produce food and energy. There's a 3D printing lab where you can print items you need instead of ordering them online. Everything is within 15 minutes from your door. So just a taster there of some of the issues that we've explored within our Sustainability Futures report for Ghelamco. Well, to discuss some of these ideas in more depth, I'm not going to do it on my own. I'm extremely pleased to say we have an esteemed panel of experts who are going to start to have a conversation around this idea of building, building practice, design, the urban environment, and architecture. Panelists, if you'd like to come and join me. Thank you.
You'll scrutinize now.
So while they are coming to join me on our podium, let me tell you a little bit about our panelists.
I think we need another lady in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you all very much indeed. So, I'm delighted to be joined by somebody you all know very well already, Marie-Julie Gheysens, who's the Head of UK International Business Development for Ghelamco. We also have Tamasine Scott from Grant Associates, Senior Landscape, and she's a Senior Landscape Architect at Grant Architects. Next, we have Bob Wigley, who is Chairman of UK Finance. And we're also joined by Dan Jestico, who is the Sustainable Design Director at Savills. And finally, we have Paul Monaghan, who is Executive Director and Head of Design at Alford Hall Monaghan Morris, who are, of course, the architects responsible for the Arc. Thank you all very much indeed for joining me today and for joining Marie-Julie. I wanted to kick things off really by focusing on those kind of three areas, the drivers that I mentioned during my presentation: eco-awakening, citizen capitalism, and betterment business. To really think about this idea of being people-centric and designing for a new society as we move through the 21st century, this the third decade of the 21st century, thinking about the changing nature of our citizen, both local and maybe global, and then thinking about the role that architecture plays in building better. Well, let's kick off with this idea of thinking about the role of sustainability. And I think we really should come to Marie-Julie first. And as we start to think, Marie-Julie, about this idea of how people globally are increasingly granular in their understanding of sustainability and how they increasingly, I think, are examining their behaviours and how they affect the planet. What were some of the guiding drivers for you when you were faced with the opportunity of ARC? What was it that you really wanted to achieve with this project?
I think circular economy in itself is a very big topic. I think we all, technology nowadays very much gives us the opportunity to create traceability and accountability towards the purpose that we have within the economy. Is that the use of your materials? Is that creating a very energy consumption friendly building, very data driven? And the mixed use perspective. Creating a climate and organization where everyone can thrive in. Is that from a working, a breathing, or a living perspective? It needs to fit all bills and needs. And if you can top it up with a little bit of lifestyle, then I think you can create something very unique.
Paul, when you were faced with this challenge, this opportunity, what for you were the sort of some of the either the guiding principles or the kind of those light bulb moments you get in design where you think, this is my opportunity to do something maybe slightly differently?
I think the main thing was that this is a building that is not like others in London. It's, and we were just talking before, I was talking with Paul about the idea of mixed-use buildings in London and mixed-use buildings in Brussels. And actually it's quite usual there to have offices and then housing above. In London, you might get shops and maybe 2 stories of shops and offices, or 2 stories of shops and housing. Here we've got 150,000 square feet of offices with housing on top, all sharing facilities at the bottom, sharing some of them sharing gardens, a high level. So I think number one, that was an unusual brief, and I think number two, the sustainable targets for the building were very high. Which is a trend that is happening in London full stop now in all offices. But I think given this was designed, 4 years ago now, it was very high for the time and is increasingly high. So I think it was those two things. But I think also it struck me with Ghelamco that they were interested in building a building that was always going to be there and always going to be owned by them. And that's a massive difference to so many developments in London where people want to flip them before they've got planning or after they've got planning. So there was a long-term possibility for sustainability. And I think that all of those components were very key to us.
Yeah. Tam, as an urban designer,
Landscape architect.
Landscape architect. What opportunities does that present to you to where you can truly think long term?
I think working on the Arc was like playtime. Essentially, as a landscape architect, I have to think about what people need, what nature needs, and then bring that together for a project brief. And the Arc gave an opportunity where you're not keeping everybody separate. You're having workers and residents all kind of interacting and sharing facilities, but also enlightening each other's world. And so it was an opportunity to create a variety of space for well-being as well as enhancing London in itself, giving it a proper address. It's really good.
Dan, you work at Savills. You're a sustainability design specialist. Yeah. How have you started to see the market begin to change and maybe something that once used to be a bit of a nice to have is becoming more central to the requirement of a new project?
Yes, I mean, having been involved in the industry for about 17 years, it sort of started off being a bit niche, but now you suddenly find yourself sort of thrust into the mainstream and ESG principles being front and centre for all new projects. And that's manifesting itself in a variety of different ways. So as you spoke about earlier, more and more people are aware of it. They're saying that the environment and climate change is increasingly important to them. And yet we see very little kind of impact on people's lifestyles. They still want to be able to drive. They still want to be able to take holidays. They still want to be able to consume and live their lifestyles. So the changing brief of sustainability has really been one of how do we make it easier for people to do the right thing? And that's where the benefits of good design, mixed-use design, bringing all of these different elements together so that people can continue to live their lifestyles without overly compromising what they want to do with their lives, but actually do so in a way that doesn't have as much impact on environmental issues. So, yeah, it's really interesting to see how that design brief has evolved over recent decades.
Bob, you're the finance guy around the table here. Now, in all the years that I've certainly been working and looking at the issue of sustainability, for many of them, it was, as I've said, either a nice to have or indeed, for quite a while, often was the issue that got sort of put at the bottom of the pile or almost laughed out of the room. And yet, increasingly, we begin to understand that sustainable investment is not just prudent, but potentially is increasingly profitable. Within you've worn many hats, and I know, for example, that you headed up you were the chairman of the Green Investment Bank Commission, but also very interestingly have written a book called Born Digital, the story of a distracted generation, looking at, I think, how our next generation are increasingly using technology to equip themselves and to provide both positive and negative lifestyle influences. Do you think we've reached this tipping point of moving towards a much better understanding of the power of positive, sustainable investment?
Absolutely. So I have two, I think, rather different perspectives on the issue. One is from, as you say, from the finance point of view. So the organisation I chair represents the UK financial services industry. It's a statement, I guess, of the obvious that you can't move to what we call a just transition without banks and finance companies enabling companies to spend the money they need to invest to create that just transition. So it isn't going to happen unless the finance industry totally embraces it. And that starts with our own organisation. So that means we all need to adopt our own net zero targets, and you'll see the big banks have done that. There's so much in your presentation I could pick up on, but the whole kind of greenwashing and relatively small amount of money spent on CSR, I wanted to make a point on that. So I think in my lifetime, we've seen companies in general, I'm not talking about finance companies, go from having a small corporate social responsibility kind of function to now what we call purpose. So companies have to have a purpose that goes beyond simply making money. They have to serve their wider group of stakeholders. And if you try and get by with a small section in your annual report which says the 3 great things you've done in CSR this year, forget it. That's not going to work with anybody. It's not going to work with your investors. The UK PRNI will be all over you like a rash. People will stop investing in your company. Your customers will stop buying your product, and no one will want to work for you. You have to embed your purpose, including sustainability in every aspect of the way you run your business. So the other aspect I have, so that's finance. We have to finance this transition, and we're going to do that if the industry embraces the move to ESG and means it. The other thing I want to pick up on is youngsters. So what's really going to drive this, I think, is Generation Z. So my book, I interviewed 200 young entrepreneurs about what was important to them in life. One of them sitting here, actually. That's why I'm here. And I was absolutely bowled over by what I heard. And if you think about what our generation is leaving Generation Z, whether it be the hangover from the financial crisis, a damaged planet, global war on terror, or now COVID debt. If I was, in Stefano's generation, I'd be pretty cross with our generation, to be honest. So they see businesses as vehicles to solving these problems that we're leaving them behind, and a damaged planet is one of them. So every single entrepreneur that came to see me was creating a venture that was not just about making money, it was about solving a societal issue. And Gen Z will very much, I think, drive the way in which we design offices,
yes,
and the way in which we think about work. And one quick final thing, just as Generation Z doesn't see a difference between the online world and the offline world, so they don't really see a difference between the workplace and the non-workplace.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by that last case study you gave of the Chinese project, where people lived where they worked. And if you think about, what working from home during COVID has taught us, is we don't actually need to go to an office. We don't need to go to a high street. So I think the communities of the future will have work and home much more integrated. And what you're seeing here, you use the word biophilic, some lovely roses. It's beautiful, but actually that needs to be inside the office, not outside it. We should feel when we're in an office environment, if we are there at all, that we are in the environment in the true sense.
Well, we've got Generation Z on the panel here, sitting in front of us. Any thoughts on that, Marie-Julie? I mean, again, going back to your idea of your vision for this project.
I think the right word, purpose, that's something that very much came to my mind. And it is important to understand what is the vision, what is the mission, what is the purpose, what do we want to be accountable for, what do we want to bring to the table. And I think it's important that we just keep pushing forward, having ideas, keep asking questions. And yes, green needs to be in and out. It's an open circulation. It's creating a dialogue of walkways. And yes, it is very important. That's why we have been working very closely as well with Tamasine, with Grant Associates, together with HMM, about how can we bring the two together. And that's why, high ceilings, openable windows, we very much encourage that.
Yeah. Tam, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think space to breathe is essentially what we're all talking about. I think it's become a commodity in our world since the pandemic. And I think the pressure from our own lives, but everyone else around us and society says we want spaces to go, breathe fresh air, have space that you actually don't feel too confined. And so whether they are inside or outside is the evolving thing, which for my world is extremely exciting, because I'm not put in a box anymore that's just green and outside. I can do fun projects that are much easier to sort of justify. Whereas at the beginning of my career, 19 years ago, it was essentially I had sustainable drainage as my weapon, that had lots of added benefits, but otherwise it was everything that was a bit sort of touchy-feely and everything was a bit fluffy and a nice to have. Yeah. Whereas now people get it. And everything I'm saying is much more understood, it's quantifiable, it's functional, and it's like an arsenal now. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And so people really understand.
Yes, so it's really encouraging, I think, to hear designers talk about the factors that you are talking about, because one of the things that came through in studying for my book was the effect that technology has on the way youngsters work in the workplace. And we have this concept of what we call the office pilots. So you're in a WeWork facility, you come in, you sit in a booth, you crack open 3 devices, you've got your laptop, you've got your iPad, you've got your mobile, you put your earbuds in, and the 2 human beings you don't talk to all day are the 2 people in the next door. By the way, tomorrow they're 2 different people because it's a hot desking facility. So, hearing you talk about how you create a sense of community environment and get people interacting with each other, because as a senior business leader, I don't know how you instill a culture in an organization where people don't physically interact with each other. I don't know how you embrace innovation in a culture where people don't interact. So the way you build the environment is going to be so fundamental to the way business develops in the future. There's nothing more important.
Well, I'd love to. Yeah, Paul, please.
I was going to say, while I do believe there'll be hubs where people can work at home, you know, we've gone through great change in the last 2 years, and I think we're going to see more flexibility. But London is full of tower cranes building new office buildings, and that's for a number of reasons. Number one, it's because effectively the Generation Z community are more politicised about the carbon crisis. So they want that these big corporates need to move into buildings that are absolutely exemplary on sustainability, and that's part of it. The second thing is exactly what these new buildings, as an architect, you need to design buildings where people want to come to them, because if not, they will stay at home. Mm-hmm. But there is huge pushes now to get people back to work all over the country, and I think that's an important part, because we had our office conference first time in 3 years, 500 of us in King's Cross. It was an extraordinary feeling to be back with 500 people. Yeah. And to try and create an ethos and somehow how do people want to work for a company when you're all online, it's been impossible. Yeah. So those things are key. But really it's all about, I have to say, all about why people want to come to work. So what facilities, so the idea of a mixed use building, the idea of external spaces, and the idea of mixing things around is important. It's funny, a lot of the tech firms like Google and LinkedIn and all of that have been well ahead of this. You know, creating sort of half the office space is given over to what I would call play space. But that's going to be the most important thing about how we recreate these. But what's pity is the carbon crisis is not being recognised sufficiently in house building, because in offices what's happened is it's become capitalised, so people want it, people pay higher rent. In housing, it still hasn't really happened.
Well, I'm going to come to Dan. Just Dan, as the real estate guy here, you've surely been through a period collectively as an industry of navel gazing and really maybe trying to unknot the thorny issue of will we, won't we be coming back to work. And whilst I think we've seen obviously a massive return to work in some key areas, in others we haven't. And I still get the sense that the jury is still out in terms of understanding how the market is going to rebalance over the next few years. What's your sense, or what you're feeling about that?
It's a good point, and time will tell. It's very difficult to predict the future, despite I'm sure you know. And the critical thing to understanding it is one of feedback. So whereas kind of when we embark on a sustainable design journey, we start out with lots of aspirations. We're very good at setting those aspirations. What we're less good at is following through on them and closing that feedback loop. So what we need to be doing with our buildings is not just kind of handing over the keys at practical completion and saying, there's your building, off you go, you use it. We need to be coming back into those spaces, work out how people are using them. Has our design intent been fulfilled in terms of, are these spaces inside these buildings that we intend for these play spaces, for this collaborative working, are they being used as intended? Or are they just sat empty as everyone kind of, as you say, goes to their desk, plugs in the headphones? So in essence, every building is a prototype. You know, we have to learn from our experiments. We have to learn about what went right and what we would do better next time, and then feed that back into the loop, because that's essentially the scientific method.
Yes.
And we're all scientists, essentially, whether we like it or not. When we kind of inhabit a building, we're either part of the experiment or the scientists conducting the experiment.
Well, I mean, Bob, this is surely just as much a software issue as it is a hardware.
Glad you used the word soft, because I want to make a soft point. I'm the finance guy, right? But I'm going to make a soft point. So one of the things that technology does is it systematically attacks the places where empathy develops. When you think about when you were growing up and you would have an eye-to-eye conversation with your parent or your child, now that's interrupted by both of them probably having a device which sits between that conversation. Whether you think about it later in life, whether you think about it in the office environment where you're stuck on your device, glued to this thing all day, communal eating is disappearing, including in the office place, yes. Right? So yeah. I think I would implore designers, as they develop office space for the future, to think about how you create empathy in the environment, because we have, I think, and COVID has sort of exacerbated a mental health crisis in our adolescents. And teaching them and giving them opportunities to empathise physically by doing this is really important. So that would be my one plea. If you think that's a wet thing to come from a finance guy, fine, I'm up for it.
I mean, as I said before, the notion of the neurotic building or the empathic building is language that we're increasingly using, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, and I think people have rejected the sort of old low ceilings, suspended ceilings with sort of lights in, with rows of desks in, and then boxes with meeting rooms. I think people have rejected all of that. You know, actually, for a long time, we did a building called the White Collar Factory on Old Street Roundabout, which is very sustainable. It's meant to basically be a reinvention of warehouse buildings, because we notice all those warehouses that every city has, and particularly creative industries love renting them as office space. But what we've found is, I just think that what we're going to get to is a point where that whole old stock of buildings is completely rejected, and we need to just sort of move on from it. And I think I'm really interested in what you were saying there about how you create spaces that facilitate this sort of conversation. But a lot of it is about people and how you run your business, to be honest, and how you make sure you facilitate those sorts of things. So, yeah.
Agreed.
Marie-Julie, let's come back to you again.
Okay.
What are your hopes for the Arc moving forward as a building? Apart, obviously, 100% occupancy, I'm sure, is probably the biggest hope.
And doubtful. Well, I guess the cross-pollination, you mentioned teamwork, it's spreading of ideas, and that it can be a beacon of innovation. And that's why we invest quite a lot of, of capex in technologies up front, because as Ghelamco, I think we can be proudly saying so that our buildings, even after 10 years or 20 years, are still in a very good condition. And we choose the right technologies that, keep the building, the performance system of it in a very good shape. So yeah.
Tam, share with us something that you've learnt doing this project, something that maybe has challenged you or that the Arc has revealed for you.
I think the Arc, simply by its nature, it's a relatively small site. Landscapes generally like to just go poof. And so making a functional, multi-purpose landscape that can be shared between different users was a challenge. We wanted to get as much in as we possibly could, but also leave space for nature. So I think the learning has been what's comfortable and what you can squeeze in. And I think the joy for me, when it opens and when it's completed, oh yeah, curves, it's lovely. But my joy will be going up onto the level 7 roof garden and seeing, say, a bumblebee or a butterfly, or seeing just life there while someone else is just sitting down reading a paper. That's, to me, done, job done, well done.
And Paul, what about you?
No, I was going to say, it's such an urban environment, says you, Ray. That garden is it must be about 3 tennis courts big. It's going to be a fantastic. What have I learned? I think working with Marie-Julie about how you mix these uses and how then us designing the architecture is one thing, but how do you run that? How do you run a garden that can it be open 24 hours a day? And how does the architecture interact with that? So I think really it's been about how you run a building that's been fascinating for me.
Well, we're coming to an end. I do want to leave a little bit of time maybe for some questions if we've got some from the floor, but I want to hear from each of our panellists one more time. And I've got the same question for each of them, and we're going to go around. We're going to start with Bob. And Bob, could you share with us, please, one personal challenge or sustainability goal that you are setting yourself and your family to achieve by 2030?
Simply to get an electric car charging point installed in my house in London, which may sound like it shouldn't be difficult, but trust me, it is.
Great.
I'm quite similar. I've got an electric charging point in my garden, but I haven't got an electric car. So so I'm halfway there, Bob.
Tam, how about you?
Well, I have 2, but they're kind of related.
Yeah, go on.
And obviously it has to be outside because I'm a landscape architect. I don't want to have a hose pipe anymore, which sounds simple, but actually it's not an easy thing to do. So
She doesn't want to have a hose pipe.
Hose pipe, so water for the garden. So that's rainwater harvesting and management and species, but it's also how we're going to use the garden, because I have a 4-year-old that likes paddling pool, so she's going to be disappointed, but we'll find a way. And then the second part to that was that I realised our garden is devoid of things like butterflies. I think it's just a national problem right now. And so in the process of changing the garden to have no hose pipe, I'm going to create bountiful butterflies. That's my mission, which I hope to do faster than 8 years, quite frankly.
Very good.
Need a few years.
Dan, how about you?
Okay, so yeah, it's bad news for my family, unfortunately, because what I want to do is essentially do myself out of a job. Make the whole concept of kind of needing to design in sustainability and energy efficiency and net zero carbon obsolete. Whether we'll do that by 2030, I don't know. That's a kind of challenge.
Good luck with that.
I think you're going to be very busy for quite a few years to come, actually. Dan. Mary-Julie, how about you?
Well, I know it's a more personal question.
No, that's good.
So,
That's good.
it's always hard for me not to link something to business, because obviously it's such a passion within. But even, you know, the recycling of everything in your home and in a business itself, I think that's something that we as a team and as a family will definitely be working on.
Yeah, very good. I'm getting really tired of washing my rubbish and then sorting it before it gets thrown out. That's recycling for most of us. And I would love to actually be able to have a mini recycling plant at home and then find a use for all of that plastic in some shape or form. I think that would be a fun thing to do. Quite what I'd make. Maybe I'd make trainers or something from all of those.
3D printing.
And 3D printing. Yeah. I think we have some time for a few questions, if anyone has one. We have quite a few members of the press here. Does anyone have a question for our panel?
Don't be shy.
No questions.
Look at that.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah, look at that. A satisfied audience. Well, thank you very much. Do you want to say a few words to close? Are you going to?
Well, look, first of all, thank you very much for coming here and participating in our very special Belgium-UK, affair.
Yeah.
It's nice to see the two worlds come together. Looking forward to many more events and to many more projects. And it's great to see that, you know, we're all like-minded and that we have a purpose.
Brilliant. So thank you all very much indeed.